Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. We'll get started really shortly. While we're waiting for all of our attendees to join, let's go around and say where we are today. I'm Julia Bryan, and I'm in Prague, Czech Republic. Joseph, where are you?
I'm dialing in from Philadelphia today at our campaign headquarters.
Oh, fantastic. Aaron, where are you?
Well, Julia, I am in dark, already sunset Bratislava, Slovakia.
Indeed, the sun set early today.
Yes. The
Tony,
season.
where are you today?
I'm actually in McLean, Virginia,
Oh,
just
fantastic.
across the river from Washington.
James, where are you?
I'm in my office in Paris, France, in violation of all applicable lockdown rules.
Uh-oh. Well, we're on lockdown too, so we understand. Emily, where are you?
I'm currently in Berlin, Germany.
Fantastic. Annaleka?
I'm in Brussels, Belgium, also in lockdown.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Ambassador Heyman, where are you today?
Well, I'm in the snowy mountains of Colorado in Aspen, Colorado.
Fantastic. And everyone, we'd love to hear where you're from. So as you're joining this call, just let us know in the chat box where you're going to be, where you're calling in from. We'd love to hear from you. It's always a pleasure. And now, Aaron, are we live on Facebook?
We are, everybody.
Fantastic. And we have over 130 people on the call, so I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Julia Bryan, and I'm the Global Chair of Democrats Abroad. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special webinar featuring Tony Blinken. I'm joined by our webinar team today of Ambassador Bruce Heyman, Annaleka Andrade, Emily Lyons, Aaron Fishbone, James Lieber, and Joseph Farsak. Introducing our special guest today will be Joseph Farsak. Joseph, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Julia. So it's great to be with you all today. I know that we have folks zoomed in from all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. You know, when I was looking at the RSVP list, I saw that we're going to have folks from the Americas and Mexico and our friends in Europe and Asia. And I saw a lot of familiar names from back in Dubai. So it's really nice to be with you all today. And I'm glad we're able to come together. So look, I just want to take a couple of seconds to express that the vice president in this campaign really care about the abroad community. And Julia, you know, if we can throw that letter into the chat or the Q&A function, that'd be great. I don't know if you all had the opportunity to take a look at this letter that Joe Biden has penned and put out to all of you. But if you haven't, please do. You know, it really expresses Joe's belief that your government has a responsibility to you as an American who's residing abroad. So please do have a look at that. And you know, today what we wanted to do really is come together for this final push on the get out to vote side, and also to thank everybody for all their efforts to turn out the abroad vote. I mean, it's approximately 9 million people outside the US. That's quite a few people. So the abroad effort is no small feat. And you know, we just really wanted to thank folks like Julia, Ambassador Heyman, James, of course, Mary, etc. There are so many people who've been working really, really hard on this, and Democrats Abroad is just an incredible organization that we're all indebted to for this effort. So now we're at the end of the road, and we're really depending on all of you, both the organizers and the people that push, and all of you folks on the call and everyone listening in. We really need to run through the tape here up until November 3rd. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the gentleman you're all actually here to hear from. He's the gentleman who holds the record for most consecutive Zoom calls in history of Zoom, Tony Blinken. So we all know Tony as the Vice President's Senior Foreign Policy Advisor on this campaign, and he's just been working tirelessly to engage with all kinds of American communities, really all over the map. You know, Tony's held a number of senior foreign policy positions over the past 3 decades, as we all know. He was Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration, serving as the nation's #2 diplomat. Prior to that, he was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama. And in the first Obama term, he was National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. And more generally, he's just been a close friend and advisor to Joe for many, many years. So I'm sure you're all very interested in hearing what Tony has to say today. And what I can tell you about Tony is that he's a real leader in the fight to implement a foreign policy that's rooted in our core values. That's something that's really, really important to him. And I think it shines through, you know, when he speaks on the topic. He's been a real human voice on this campaign, and we're just glad we had the opportunity to bring Tony in to speak with all of you today in the abroad community. So Tony, it's now over to you to bring us home. Thank you.
Joseph, thank you so much. Thanks for your kind words. Thanks for everything you're doing, and to Julia as well for your incredible leadership of this community. to my friends and colleagues, Bruce, James, everyone else who's helped put this together. I got to tell you, this is kind of a special moment for me. It's nice that it's coming at what I hope is the end of this long road, because in effect I'm one of you. I spent a good chunk of my life as an American abroad. I grew up between the ages of 9 and 18 in Paris. I was back there as an adult for a few years, and so I know what it's like being an American abroad, and particularly around election time. There's something very special about that, and especially finding ways to have connectivity with the United States as we get into the end game. It's also something I think the Vice President can relate to. He's been an internationalist his entire career. I remember once years ago when he was running for re-election in Delaware to the United States Senate, his opponent thought the best way to attack him would be to have posters and bumper stickers and billboards that said, "Joe Biden, Senator from Europe." Didn't work. He got reelected anyway. But he, as you know very well, understands the world, understands the particular role of Americans abroad. I commend the letter that Joseph and Julia flagged. That's hopefully in your chat functions there. Let me just give you a quick picture of the state of the race 4 days from Election Day. Hard to believe. It's been a long road to this point. A few things that are really striking, and you've all seen this, you've all read it, you've all heard it. The early voting is breaking records, and that's in and of itself a wonderful thing, because we're seeing so many people who've never voted before participate. We're seeing a lot of folks who did not vote in 2016 coming back and voting this time, and that early vote has been pretty good for us. One of the interesting benefits of it is that because in many states we're able to know who's voted and who hasn't, that allows us in the end game, especially on Election Day itself, to focus our efforts on people who haven't voted to try and get them out and get them to the polls. President Trump's relying, of course, on Election Day itself. A large number of Republicans are waiting till Election Day. We'll see exactly how large it is. We'll see what impact the virus has. But right now we have a good snapshot, and we've got to make sure that the last reel of the moving picture has a happy ending. We have a clear path to 270 electoral votes, and it's this. If we hold on to the 20 states plus the District of Columbia that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 and add 3 states in the Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, we're at 278 electoral votes. Right now, we're up in all 3 of those states, probably around 5 or 6 points, maybe a little bit more in Wisconsin, maybe a little bit less in Pennsylvania. But there are a lot of imponderables that come in at the end that could affect that, which I'll come to in a minute. We also, I think, are likely to carry 2 congressional districts, one in Nebraska, one in Maine, where those are 2 states that break out their electoral votes by congressional district. That would get us to 280. So that's probably the best snapshot of realistically where we are. Now, you all know this too. There are a bunch of big states that went for Trump last time that are at least in play. Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, maybe Georgia, Iowa. But all of those states are within the margin of error. So they could easily remain red, just as they could flip to us. And then you got Texas and Ohio that are certainly possible. I'm not sure I'd say they're probable. And maybe it's more likely than not that they remain red, but we're making a very, very, very determined effort in both Kamala Harris's in Texas today. Amazing early vote there. So you never know. But what that amounts to is the difference between winning this election with 270 to 280 electoral votes or 350 or more electoral votes is probably a swing of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50,000 votes in a handful of states. It's, in a sense, that close. And there are a couple of things that, of course, you've read about or heard about that are realistic possibilities. There's the so-called red mirage, in which President Trump performs very well on Election Day, better than we do because more of our votes came in early. But because the votes that come in early are counted last in most places, the early returns could show President Trump leading. And I'm sure he will miss no opportunity to try to prematurely claim victory if that's the way it goes. And then, of course, there's the real likelihood in close places that we'll have disputes, litigation, pushed by President Trump. can tell you that we've dedicated more resources, both human and financial, to doing everything possible to make sure that voters had information, to make sure that we could help them participate, to make sure that their vote is protected and the integrity of the election is protected. And we're ready for anything that comes on election day or thereafter. But this could get challenging. So what does that all mean? It really does come down to your votes. Now that we're just a few days out, it's all about voter mobilization. It's all about getting the votes in. And, you know, it sometimes seems like a distant proposition, but in this election, I think more than any I've been involved in, the votes of Americans abroad can make a huge difference, and maybe even in some of these very close places, a decisive difference. So if you haven't already done so, you actually can still cast a vote right now that counts. And in some places, and I think Julia can get into this, and we'll have information on the chat, you can still register even in a number of states right up till election day. So we want to make sure we get you that information, and you can get online and actually get a lot of things done. You don't have to, in many places, actually mail in your ballot. You can do it via email. You can do it via fax if you still have one of those things. There are ways to do it, and the vote will count. Last thing I'll say before we maybe get into some questions is, as you've heard, the Vice President is focused on and cares about the well-being of Americans who live outside the United States. The letter that he addressed to the abroad community refers to every American abroad as an ambassador for the United States in your own right. And this is something I feel very strongly from my own experience. I know what it was like as an American abroad, as a kid growing up in France, as I said in my case, where, you know, every day you're in conversations, you're if you're at school, with your classmates, if you're in business, with folks you're working with people in your communities, and the conversations inevitably revolve around things involving the United States, involving our policies, involving our role in the world, involving what we're doing, and you become an advocate. And of course, that's been a little bit difficult these days, but it's maybe more important than it's been because, in a sense, so many of you are counterweights to what people around the world are seeing on their TV screens during the Trump presidency. And I know that's tough. It's tough explaining to neighbors and colleagues what America seems to have become these last 4 years. But now we have an opportunity, maybe the most important we've ever had, to show the world what America is really all about, where we really want to go, what our country really is. And simply by winning the election and by sending President Trump into retirement, we will repudiate Trumpism, and we will take a big step, not sufficient, but necessary, to recapturing the American flag for ourselves and for the world. So there are very good initial indications, I think, of what the American abroad vote can do. We're looking at doubling the abroad vote this year. That would be remarkable. And again, it's really going to be critical in some of these battleground states where the margins could be a difference of 20 or 30,000 votes either way. So thank you for everything you're doing to vote yourselves, to encourage your families, your friends, your networks to do the same thing. Why don't I stop there, and we can take some questions.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Tony. That was amazing to hear from you and from the campaign, because we're all so anxious at this moment. I know you guys are orange tenterhooks, we are too, and hearing directly from you is very great for us. And I wanted to just follow up with the point that you made about registrations. There are a lot of very important states where you can still register to vote. I've put them in the chat box. And remember, if you've voted in the past, you're probably already registered. There are a lot more states where you can still request your ballot, and go to votefromabroad.org for that information. If you're sitting on this call right now and you haven't gotten started, go there. If you haven't gotten your ballot yet, go there. Just, and then if you know anyone who hasn't, go make sure they are going there. But it's just so important. And I really appreciate Tony for magnifying that message to you guys about the importance of our votes. As of today, we've seen 2.85 times more traffic on Vote From Abroad this year than in 2016. We are poised to double the overseas vote. And I'm so excited about it because it's not about just one person, it's about millions of people getting up and taking action. We've seen 1.25 million people on our website this year, and that is you and thousands and hundreds of thousands of other people. So thank you so much, everyone. And now to our questions. Bruce, would you like to ask our very first question?
Sure, I'd love to. And before I ask the question, I just want to pile on just a minute. Votefromabroad.org. Go there, pass the word along. We are in the final stages, and like a marathon, we're going to run into the tape. We're just got to keep going, every one of us. So now, Tony, maybe you can take a few minutes, if you wouldn't mind, and paint for us a picture of what a Biden administration's first steps on foreign policy just look like. What are the broad strokes, the overall vision, the philosophy? How would you characterize it to so many Americans who are listening in from all around the world who really want to get a sense of what Joe is going to do when we first kick this off?
Well, Bruce, thank you. And first of all, it's great to be with you. Bruce is a remarkable representative for our country as ambassador, and has been a great colleague and companion in this effort. So it's always great to be with you. You know, the next president, let's call him Joe Biden, is going to inherit two things: a divided country at home, and a world increasingly in disarray. And when it comes to the latter, that world in disarray, the question that we have to face is, what can the United States do to try to help put our globe a little bit back on its axis? And I think it boils down to three words that really motivate and sum up the vice president's vision. And they're pretty simple, but no less important for being simple. Leadership, cooperation, democracy. And that also happens, Bruce, I think, to sum up the profound differences between President Trump and Joe Biden. In that sense, the choice could not be clearer. The contrast could not be starker. So just a quick word about each word. First, the leadership piece. Whether we like it or not, the world tends not to organize itself. Until the Trump administration, the United States had played a lead role in doing a lot of that organizing and helping to write the rules and shape the norms, animate the institutions that govern the way countries relate to each other. We made our share of mistakes, but on balance, that leadership produced positive, important results for America, and I think for many countries around the world. Now, what we've seen in the last almost 4 years is a total abdication of that responsibility by President Trump, putting our country in full retreat from our allies, from international organizations, from hard-won agreements. And here's the problem. When we're not engaged, when we're not leading, then one of two things happens. Either some other country tries to take our place, but probably not in a way that advances our own interests and values, or maybe just as bad, no one does. And then you tend to have a vacuum that is filled by bad things before it's filled by good things. Either way, that's not good for the United States. So in the first instance, I think Joe Biden will reassert American leadership, leading with our diplomacy. We'll actually show up again, day in, day out. And we'll engage the world not as it was in 2009 or 2017, but as it is, and especially as we anticipate it's likely to become in the coming years. We have all sorts of rising powers. We have new actors, non-state actors on the scene. They're empowered by technology, by information. We have to find ways to bring them along if we are going to make real progress. And I'd say on the leadership piece, Bruce, a Biden-Harris administration would act with both humility and confidence. Humility, because most of the world's problems are not about us in the first instance, even if they affect us, and we just can't flip a switch and expect to solve them, but also with confidence that America, acting at its best, which it hasn't been in the last 4 years, still has a greater ability than any other country on earth to mobilize others for the greater good. That's the leadership piece. Cooperation. I suspect that most of us would agree, when we think about it, that not a single one of the really big challenges we face and that affect every American potentially, whether it's climate change, whether it's mass migration, whether it's technological disruption, or a pandemic disease, not a single one can be met by any one country acting alone, even one as powerful as the United States. And we also know there's no wall high enough or wide enough to contain these challenges. But at the very time, we need to find new ways to cooperate and bring other countries along. By nearly every measure, the credibility and influence of the United States under President Trump has been in free fall. Some of you have seen, for example, the work that Pew does with its global surveys, where it's looking at public opinion in dozens, even more than 100 countries, about the United States, among other things. Well, in the most recent global survey, people in country after country had more confidence in Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping to do the right thing regarding world affairs than they do in the President of the United States. President Trump talks about making America first. Well, there is one area where he's made America first, and that's in his tragic mismanagement of COVID-19, where we're about 4% of the world's population and 20% of its deaths. And that's had profound repercussions on the reputation and influence of the United States. So Joe Biden's going to have to pick up the pieces of that particular carnage that President Trump has wrought, salvaging our reputation, rebuilding confidence in our leadership, mobilizing other countries, starting with our allies, to meet new challenges together. Last piece is this, democracy. Again, very simple, but hugely important. I think if you ask the Vice President, he would say that it remains the best answer to most of the challenges we face. It is the foundation of our strength, both at home and abroad. It does reflect how we see ourselves, and at least until recently, how the world sees us. But we know that democracy is under challenge, and that matters in a big way. First, the strength of our democracy at home is directly tied to our ability to be a force for progress around the world and to mobilize that collective action I was talking about. Unfortunately, President Trump has been engaged in a daily assault on our own democracy, on its institutions, on its values, on its people, and that has tarnished, deeply tarnished, our ability to lead. The other side is that other democracies are a source of strength for the United States, especially when we find ways to act together. But we also know that democracy's been in retreat. Some of you will have seen the work, for example, of Freedom House that's been tracking this for decades. Of the 40 or so countries ranked fully free in the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s, half have fallen backwards on various metrics of democracy. People talk about a democratic recession, and autocracies from Russia to China are trying to exploit that and add fuel to our own troubles. Here again, the very moment when other democracies are looking to the United States to be a leader of the free world, we have a president who, in embracing autocrats and putting his finger in the eye of other democratic countries, and as the leading consumer and purveyor of conspiracy theories, he basically seems to have suited up for the other team. So what Joe Biden will start with is renewing our democracy at home, and then revitalizing our alliances and with democracies around the world. I think he offers the possibility with Kamala Harris both of bringing us together as Americans, but also as a community of democracies. As he likes to say, we need to lead not just with the example of our power, but with the power of our example.
Thank you. That's awesome.
I second that. And our next question is going to be coming from Anelika Andrade. Anelika?
Hello, I'm Monica Andrade. I live in Brussels, Belgium, and I actually wanted to let you know that I actually read your book, Ali versus Ali, when I was in undergrad. I actually had to do a whole analysis and essay about it.
So now I know where the third copy went. Thank you.
There you go. Well, or maybe we had a professor that was really a big fan of yours and had us read the copy of the book.
I apologize in advance. Someone once said about my book that it's the kind of book that once put down is very hard to pick up again, but I'm glad you got through it.
I got through it. It was really insightful, and it was my second international relations class. So it was a make it or break it. It was the decision time of if I was able to go through the book and completely write an essay about it, I was able to carry on through the 2 more years that I was left, that I had left for international relations. So it's very exciting to meet you. And you were describing the lack of trust that there is around the world in America. So what do you think needs to happen to rebuild America's trust and the credibility and moral standing in the eyes of the rest of the world?
So this really is at the heart, I think, of everything. And look, I have to tell you, election day itself is going to be hugely important. I really believe that if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are elected next week, that in and of itself sends a really powerful message to the world about what our country really is, what it stands for, what it wants to be. And I think that will help send a message that in some ways, not in every way, but in some ways, the last 4 years have been an aberration, not revelatory of what America is all about. Conversely, if President Trump were to knowingly be reelected, I think we'd be lost for generations in terms of the attitudes toward the United States around the world. So we got to win next week. But that's necessary, but not sufficient. I think there's then an opening for the United States to re-engage in the kind of leadership I talked about, to lead with our diplomacy, to work to be a problem solver, and to show up day in, day out. That in and of itself will also make a difference. And I think there's an appetite, a desire for the United States to do that. But, I also think we can't kid ourselves, because in some ways, maybe even in profound ways, I would argue that President Trump has been less a cause and more a symptom of deep-rooted problems that afflict most democracies. He's also been an accelerant, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that many of these challenges and problems did not exist before President Trump and will not continue to exist after President Trump. And I think we have to grapple with those. We have a profound trust deficit in institutions and in governance. We have growing inequities in our societies. We have a problem of various forms of corruption that, again, eat away at trust and credibility. So one of the things we really need to do, and again, Joe Biden is focused on, is actually looking at how we revitalize our democracy at home in order, I think, to enhance our leadership abroad. So there's a whole agenda. And one thing I'd point you to is he did an essay in Foreign Affairs, I think it was in January or February, that was ostensibly to lay out his foreign policy. But if you go back and read that, I think you'll see that the first 20% or so is all about how we revitalize our democracy at home. So I'd invite you to take a look at that. It really does sum up his vision for how America strengthens itself at home in order to be a more effective actor around the world.
Good. Thank you. And I'll take a look at the essay. Thanks.
Thanks.
Emily, would you like to ask our next question?
Yes, my pleasure. During your career, you've seen a close number of conflicts and instances of gross oppression, some of which the U.S. has intervened in, like in the Balkans, but others where the U.S. has not, like in Rwanda. The disastrous Iraq War has made many Americans more wary of humanitarian intervention. So what do you imagine would be the Biden administration's approach to these types of questions? And when should the U.S. consider the use of such force in international affairs?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenging one, because on the one hand, I think with Vice President Biden, you start with someone who has a profound idealistic core, and in many ways, what got him into public life was a revulsion at the abuse of power, whether individual to individual, institution to individual, country to individual, or community. And as a result, when he's seen, for example, people having their rights trampled on in other countries, or even worse, ethnically cleansed or acts of genocide, he's felt very strongly that if the United States has the ability to do something about it, it should. And that's one of the things that motivated his strong leadership, for example, in the Balkans in the 1990s. Having said that, that idealism also has to be tempered by realism, by reality, by what we can and can't do, what we can and can't accomplish, and what the costs and consequences are. So I think if he were answering the question, the vice president would probably say, when it comes to use of force, as a last resort, not a first resort, that you have to start with that. to defend our vital interests, an ongoing or imminent threat to our country, to our people, to our allies, where the military mission itself is clear and achievable, and also military and economically sustainable. And maybe most important of all, with the so-called informed consent of the American people through their elected representatives. The Vice President was a very strong defender and proponent of congressional war powers when he was in Congress, but I think he'd be very serious about that as president too. Having said all that, it's also important, I think, to make appropriate distinctions. He is committed to ending the so-called forever wars, the large, open-ended deployments of American forces in places of conflict with no clear strategy or end date. And indeed, when he was vice president, he was responsible, put in charge of working on the plan that brought 150,000 Americans back from Iraq. But I think he would also tell you that we need to be able to distinguish between that and, for example, the very targeted, very cabined use of force, particularly, for example, special operators in places where their presence can make a difference and they can leverage local forces to do the heavy lifting. A good example of that, arguably, is or was in Syria, where we had, at best, a couple of thousand special operators dealing with ISIS, where they were leveraging 70 or 80,000 local Kurdish and Arab forces who did the heavy fighting and defeated the so-called caliphate. So you also have to be able to look at that and distinguish. But the main thing is this: if we get back to a place where America is really leading with its diplomacy and where its leadership is looked to, we have a greater ability, as I said, than other countries to mobilize positive collective action, to get others in on the deal, to bring our collective weight to bear when a population is threatened, where people's rights are being trampled, as well as something that goes to our core security. And that means that we can hopefully be more effective in deterring conflicts in the first place, or dealing with them effectively, efficiently, and at appropriate costs if we have to.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really reassuring answer for many of our members.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So now we have a bunch of questions in the audience. Aaron, would you like to read us one?
Sure. Sure. There's a whole lot of questions that we're getting, and so I'm going to compile a few of them together into one. But maybe I'll single out one question, which was asking if you could play that guitar in the background to soothe us all and calm our nerves. Calm our nerves as everyone's so stressed out and watching and make sure their ballots have been received and accepted by their local elections offices. But maybe on election day. We're a whole bunch of questions now about trade policy with the United States and the UK. Boris Johnson's playing hardball with the European Union because he's getting a good deal from the Trump administration and a good set of promises. What would a Biden administration set of terms with the UK be when it comes to trade policy?
Well,
thank you.
I don't want to. Thank you. Appreciate the question. I don't want to get ahead of that. It's something obviously we'll, if given the opportunity, we'll be looking at. But let me speak a little bit more broadly, maybe about trade and particularly with regard to Europe, since I think that may be a concern as well. And I think we start from the proposition that, as it happens, about 95% of the world's consumers happen not to live in the United States. So it's profoundly in our interest to reach them and to be able to make sure that we can sell our products and share our ideas and services. And at the same time, as I was saying earlier, we also have a profound interest in being part of the group that actually sets the rules, the norms, animates the institutions that govern trade relations too. So we need to be in the game. I'd say with regard to Europe more generally, and the EU is our largest market, the largest market in the world. And so we need to, I think, improve economic relations. And in particular, we want to bring to an end what has really been an artificial trade war that the Trump administration has inflicted. That's poisoned relations, cost jobs, also increased costs for consumer. So I think instead of hurting our own people and fighting with our democratic allies, we ought to be working on a fair approach to international trade and investment. And there is a lot of scope to increase transatlantic trade from what's already a sizable base. Trade liberalization is never easy, but at least US-EU trade liberalization should be easier because at the end of the day, we kind of share the same basic goals of high standards regarding the environment, regarding labor, regarding intellectual property, et cetera. But I think when it comes to trade, you'd see a couple of things from a Biden administration. First, he believes very strongly that we have to invest in the competitiveness of our own people. If we're going to further liberalize trade, our folks have to be armed to compete in a more and more open world. And so he's laid out in some detail a program for making those investments. And it's pretty much across the spectrum, starting with education, but also things like infrastructure, like healthcare, and then more specifically, research and development, training, et cetera. And then once armed to compete, if you're pursuing these agreements in the future, we have to do it in a different way. The fact of the matter is there are, as I mentioned earlier, a whole bunch of stakeholders who have much greater ability than ever before because of technology, because of information, to basically veto the decisions or agreements reached by national governments or by international organizations. And so if they're not in on any agreement from the takeoff, as opposed to the landing, there's a pretty good chance that whatever you wind up negotiating is going to be, in effect, dead on arrival because it will be vetoed by one of these groups. So we want to make sure that we have these different stakeholders at the table in negotiations, in an administration as well. That's the most likely way you're going to get to some sustainable outcomes. Last point is this, just with regard to the UK. We want to see, we will see very close relations between the United States and the UK. We'd also like to see, within the parameters of Brexit, a close relationship between the EU and the UK. And so we have to see how that unfolds over the next weeks before the end of the year. And then we will see where we are. You've heard the Vice President speak to his conviction, though, that any agreement reached between the EU and the UK protect the peace agreement in Northern Ireland. So that's something that's important to him that he's expressed himself on. But at the end of the day, let's see where we are, hopefully next January, and we'll see where the EU and the UK are.
Thank you very much.
So our next question is going to be from Bruce. Ambassador Hammond, go ahead.
So Tony, I'd like to ask you about something that's near and dear to your heart and you've had so much experience with. And yet over this last term of the Trump administration, we've seen such a hollowing out of the State Department. The morale is really low. I know you're probably talking to still a number of our former colleagues that are working within the State Department, but so many are gone now. And could you just talk about the importance of the State Department and how is it that in a Biden administration we're going to rebuild this this institution and the Build Back Better mantra? So could you just run through your thoughts here?
Yeah, Bruce, I know we share this this perspective. One of the things that has been so personally hurtful to me is to see what has happened to the State Department during this administration. I had the honor and privilege of starting my career in government there back in the early 1990s and finishing it there the last couple of years of the Obama-Biden administration. And so I've been working closely with Foreign Service officers, civil servants for the better part of 25 years. And indeed, what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing from people is exactly what you describe. The morale is through the floor. We've seen a real hollowing out basically at every level. The number of people taking the Foreign Service exam has been cut at least in half. So that's at the very start of the process. Mid-career people, folks who are in 10, 12, 15 years, who are really the heart of the department in so many ways and its future senior leadership. We've seen an exodus. And at the most senior levels, the people with the most experience. Literally, President Trump's first Secretary of State, Secretary Tillerson, offered them buyout packages. and a number of them said yes. So we have a lot of talent that's left the department. That's one problem. The other problem, though, is that the department has been so politicized, egregiously so. Political coercion is running rampant in the department. Efforts to root out so-called deep staters, efforts to find alleged opponents of the president and to kick them out. And this has created a terrible climate within the department. It's also profoundly misguided because, Bruce, I suspect you had the same view. As I said, I've worked with foreign service officers and civil service for the better part of 25 years. I could not begin to tell you, among the many hundreds, if not more, that I've worked with, who's a Democrat, who's a Republican, who's an independent. That's not the way they roll. And it was a grievous mistake and misjudgment for the Trump administration to see the department in that way. So a couple of things. I think you'd see very early on in a Biden administration the value that Joe Biden places on diplomacy in general and the State Department as our leading tool in advancing our diplomacy in particular. And there would be very clear messages sent from day one about that. A foreign policy that actually leads with diplomacy, that makes clear how important the department is to our national security, to our foreign policy, to our conduct in the world. You'll see that manifest itself in all sorts of ways. But one last point I would emphasize, too. We need to do a better job in making sure that the folks leading our foreign policy at all levels actually reflect the diversity of our country. That diversity is our greatest strength. And why would we not want to see that reflected more fully in our foreign policy? So we've taken that to heart. And one of the things I'm really proud of on this campaign is, as you know, we set up working groups from day one that kind of look like a mini State Department for foreign policy. So we have a working group for Europe, for Asia, for Latin America, for Africa, for various issues like arms control and nonproliferation, democracy, you name it. But we also established a working group on day one for diversity and inclusion in national security. And that group has done remarkable work, not just in identifying diverse talent for a potential administration, but also identifying some of the systemic barriers to making sure that we really do have a diverse foreign policy apparatus in the United States. And also focusing on not just diversity for diversity's sake, but genuine inclusion, not checking the box, not tokenism, but making sure that this diverse talent that we have is genuinely included in the formulation of our foreign policy. So one of the things I'm really excited about, if we're fortunate enough on Tuesday, is working to put that into action.
That'd be great. I have these conversations with folks when we talk about the Hatch Act and how assiduously the Obama-Biden administration followed the Hatch Act, the rules, the nonpartisanship. And it was all about the concept of public service, not self-service. And it was the concept of, of doing things for your country, swearing in over the Constitution, not over an individual. So I'm so glad to hear your comments.
Bruce, you were so right. And by the way, there's one other thing, that just is a sign of this, of where we are. As you know, every year, surveys are done of all of the federal agencies, of all of the employees, to gauge what their quality of work life is. And the most recent one that was done at the State Department a year ago found, among other things, that political coercion was running rampant in the department. And here's one that struck me. The different bureaus of the department are queried individually as well. And the legal advisor's office is asked how they view the honesty and integrity of the senior leadership. And 35% said they didn't see it, that they had real problems with the honesty and integrity of the senior leadership, versus 0% when asked that same question in 2016, when John Kerry was leading the department and Barack Obama and Joe Biden were president and vice president.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I think our next question is going to be back to Anelika. So Anelika, would you go ahead?
Sure. Okay, this is on a topic close to my heart. So when asked about immigration and the US border with Mexico, VP Biden has often discussed the need to help Northern Triangle countries and Central America generally to grow economically. So could you go into a bit more detail about what steps a Biden administration might take to A, help those countries create more opportunities at home economically, and B, address their severe security problems in the form of these murderous gangs that are making life unsustainable for so many people living in those countries?
Yeah, so this is something that really is near and dear to the vice president's heart, and something I think he worked very hard on when he was vice president. And what we want to do now, if given the opportunity, actually has its roots in the Northern Triangle Initiative that the vice president led back in 2014 to 2015, 2016. A plan focused on Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, to help them take concrete steps to deal with the drivers of migration. What was pushing people to take these incredible risks to try to come to the United States? Parenthetically, when you hear people talk about this, sometimes you really want to hit your head against the table. I mean, the idea that someone wakes up in the morning and says, gee, wouldn't it be fun today to leave everything I know behind? My family, my friends, my community, my culture, my language, and maybe put myself in the hands of traffickers and take this incredibly arduous journey. And maybe if I make it, go to a place that may or may not really want me. Wouldn't that be a fun thing to do today? The fact of the matter is, people have to be driven by profound things to take that risk. And by the way, often people who are remarkably courageous, energetic, determined, and that's why waves of migration of one kind or another have been the most profound source of strength for our country. But when it comes to the Northern Triangle countries, you also want to look at ways to ameliorate circumstances so that people don't have to feel that they have to make that choice and that decision. You have to look at what are the drivers that are forcing people to uproot their lives and try to make that hazardous journey. So that includes things like fighting corruption, improving security, poverty reduction, development. And that Northern Triangle plan that the vice president led on in the Obama-Biden administration, somehow he secured about $750 million from a Republican Congress for the Northern Triangle, but it was tied to concrete reforms that these countries would make. And we started to see some progress and success. Now, going forward, the plan that the vice president has is basically would be funded with about $4 billion over 4 years. And it would focus on a few things. Mobilizing private investment in these countries, because the private sector is the key generator of jobs and growth. Addressing endemic corruption, which is such a great driver for people. We've got a number of very practical things that we can do there. One of the things we'd be looking at, for example, is increasing our Treasury and Justice Department presence to help fight organized crime, deal with money laundering. There are a number of anti-corruption mechanisms that we'd be supporting, as we did successfully, for example, in Guatemala until that was reversed. And then really cracking down on corruption facilitators in these governments or regimes, including, for example, denying them the ability to come to the United States, send their families here, get educated here, park their money here, etc. Tax reform is important. Training for returned migrants is important so that they have something credible to go back to. But also some things that we found were drivers that need to be addressed, including gender-based violence and including climate change. So it's really the opposite of what President Trump is doing or not doing. It's a strategic view of how to deal with this. It's focused on the need to fight, as I said, fight corruption and reform systems. It recognizes that trade as well as aid has a real development role. And again, it underscores the importance of things like gender and climate as drivers. But it's also, again, tied to governments making their own investments and making real reform, not just throwing money at the problem. And again, we demonstrated that we can make progress on this at the end of the Obama administration. I think if given 4 years, we can make a real difference.
Thank you for walking us through all that detail and this strategic and holistic plan.
Thank you.
James, would you like to go next?
Sure. Tony, over the last few years, a number of allied countries have been moving towards autocracy, democracies that are moving towards illiberal democracy. I'm thinking obviously of countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Poland, and the Philippines. These are all countries that are theoretically our allies, but many of them are acting in ways that, do not suggest that we're aligned, at least in terms of values. And in the cases of Turkey, they are actually becoming an acute problem in the Mediterranean. And as I'm sure you've seen, the degradation of relations with France is something of a concern. And of course, Turkey is a NATO ally, and that makes it all the more difficult when they're stirring up trouble. So the question is, what kind of steps do you think a Biden administration would take to reset these relationships, but I assume projecting, our values of democracy and human rights that have been essentially disregarded over the last 4 years?
So, James, I think this is again a real core challenge, and we need some right sizing, because one of the things we've seen in the last 4 years is President Trump basically giving blank checks to countries that were either out and out autocracies or were exhibiting, unfortunately, autocratic tendencies. And that blank check sends a very powerful message, unfortunately, negative message around the world, that leaders can act with impunity and don't have to worry about the reaction of the United States. So I think that too would change on day one, because Joe Biden knows who our friends are, he knows who our foes are, and they know that he knows. And so I think you'd already start with from a different place. It's more complicated with countries that are in one way or another partners or even allies in the case of Turkey, but are showing in different ways some of this backsliding. But take the case of Turkey. I mean, that's a good one. I don't think we can sugarcoat real differences. We've seen domestic trends in Turkey that are very negative. We've seen some of this expansion in the Mediterranean that's certainly troubling. One of the things that's been a real thorn has been Turkey's decision to buy and deploy Russian air defense systems that, for a NATO ally, should be really unacceptable. So, there's certainly ways of making known our unhappiness with that. For example, Turkey wants to buy F-35s. Well, if this air defense system is deployed, I don't think that would be very likely. And then there may well be very specific sanctions tied to the purchase of Russian defense equipment under the law that would need to be applied. Having said that, Turkey's also obviously a major player with its own legitimate interests, and a continued downward spiral in the relationship would not be in our interest. It remains a NATO ally, obviously. It's a player and sometimes a partner for many regional security challenges, counterterrorism, Syria, Libya in different ways. And of course, there's also the risk of pushing Turkey totally away from the alliance, which at the end of the day only benefits countries that don't want to see Turkey facing west, like Russia. So I think some of the problems in the relationship require pretty wide-ranging regional responses, like energy security, responsible energy development in the Eastern Med, resolving these long-standing conflicts in Libya, as well as Syria, making sure that we actually are adhering to democratic standards in all of the multilateral institutions. So some of these things and some of the friction points with Turkey, I think, could be addressed in that way. But there's also, again, this personalization of the relationship between President Trump and President Erdogan. And that I don't think that's helped either. So I think if we are very clear about what our interests are, if we're very clear about what our values are, then I think Turkey will have to decide whether it wants to make appropriate adjustments or not, and we'll go from there. I would say, the Vice President knows President Erdogan very well, and he has a history of speaking very frankly to him. There have been a couple of articles recently that have drawn out the pretty sharp contrast between the way President Trump has approached some of Mr. Erdogan's demands, for example, when it comes to some court cases in the United States, or when it comes to the extradition of Fethullah Gulen, and the way Joe Biden addressed them when he was vice president. So I think there'd be some right sizing that would come just from a change in presidents.
Thank you.
For our next to last question, Emily, go ahead.
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned Russia. I think Russia has been something that's been on everyone's mind for the last 4 years. So, there's no need to really rattle off the long list of areas of conflict and mistrust between our nations or Russia and the West. But there are many areas where we do need to discuss and cooperate. So from nuclear weapons and arms control to the UN Security Council to conflicts around the world, like in Syria and Azerbaijan. So how do we engage with Russia, and also taking into account potential or their interference with our U.S. elections, and looking at the upcoming election, a potential role they could play in that? What is that desired relationship that we'll have with them?
So thanks. That's also one of the, I think, most important front burner questions that we have. First, with regard to election interference, the vice president's been extremely clear about that. He put out a pretty detailed statement a couple of months ago saying that any country that interfered in our elections would have to bear real costs and real consequences. And he laid out what a number of those might be. And so I think Russia and Mr. Putin have to understand that if they continue to interfere, and for that matter, given the ongoing and existing interference, that is not going to go without cost and consequences. More generally, though, again, when it comes to the challenges posed by Russia, you kind of have to start with making sure that you're actually standing up to and confronting Mr. Putin, not embracing him in ways that are still inexplicable, as we've seen under President Trump. And it really is inexplicable. And maybe one day we'll finally understand this. But whether it's standing on the world stage next to Vladimir Putin and saying, in effect, you take his word over that of our own intelligence services about Russian interference in our elections, or whether it's getting a report in the morning on your desk in the Oval Office about Russia putting bounties on the heads of American forces in Afghanistan, and then doing nothing about it, speaking on the phone to Putin at least 6 times after getting that report and not even raising it, even inviting him to the United States. Again, very hard to understand what is going on here. What is easy to understand is that's not what Joe Biden as president would do. So you do have to start with where Russia or Mr. Putin are acting aggressively or egregiously, with standing up to it, with confronting it, and being very clear about that. I also think it's very important not to do what President Trump has done, which is to repeatedly trash NATO, and even, according to reports, strongly consider pulling the United States out of NATO, but instead working to strengthen NATO's deterrence, investing in new capabilities to deal with a whole host of new challenges in cyberspace, in outer space, under the sea, artificial intelligence, electronic warfare, as well as providing robust security assistance to countries like Ukraine or Georgia or in the Western Balkans. But even as we're being very clear and specific with Mr. Putin about what he risks if he acts aggressively or egregiously, it might also be useful to remind him what he has to gain, including through trade, investment, a seat at the table, if Russia changes course and acts in a more positive way. That would also, by the way, help Russia relieve some of its growing dependence on China. And there, as you say, are areas where we need to be talking, we need to be engaging. There are areas, for example, when it comes to strategic stability, where we have a strong shared interest in making sure we preserve it, including by extending the New START agreement, which is something that the vice president would do. I also hope we find ways to more effectively restore some people-to-people contacts, to support civil society. It's very hard given Moscow cracking down on it, but there are creative ways to do that, because our beef is not with the Russian people, far from it. It's with the decisions and actions that President Putin has taken. So I think there's room for actually working on some things of mutual interest together. But if we are not standing up to the aggression, to the egregious actions, it won't be on our terms, and that's not acceptable.
Great, thank you for that.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and dig into our questions. Do you have any last word before we wrap up the call?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for what you're doing, just by being engaged, obviously by voting, by encouraging your friends, your families, your networks to do the same thing. And I just say at the end, every election in some sense is a choice, and it's different policies. And I have some Republican friends, some of whom may still be voting for President Trump because maybe they like a tax cut, or maybe they like deregulation, or maybe they like a judge on the court. But I think we all know something, which is that maybe more than any election in our lifetimes, this one is about so much more than a choice between different policies. And I happen to think our policies are far superior and much better reflect where the American people want to go. But it is actually about more than that. It really is about the character of our president and, as the vice president likes to say, the soul of our nation. I remember as a child, you start to learn the founding mythology of your country. And probably most of us as Americans, maybe one of the first stories we heard as children was about our first president, George Washington, who famously could not tell a lie. Well, our current president cannot tell the truth about anything. And he has used the vast power of his office to divide us, to pit American against American. And so I think the question I ask is, what does it profit a person to win the world but lose your soul? No policy is worth it. With Joe Biden, what you see is really what you get. There is no difference between the public and private person. The empathy is real. The desire to bring people together is real. And I think that responds to a profound need across communities in the United States in this particular moment. So bottom line is this: we always say, every 4 years, we say this is the most important election in our lifetime. This one really is. I don't think the choice has ever been clearer. The stakes have never been greater. And the United States cannot afford another 4 years of Donald J. Trump. The world cannot afford another 4 years of Donald J. Trump. Joe Biden is president. He will summon the better angels of our nature. Just by his own character, by his own decency, he will work to bring us together, to try to heal us at home, to lead in the world, and to move the country forward. And that's pretty much all you can ask. So thanks for everything you're doing, and please keep doing it right through Tuesday.
We absolutely will. Thank you so much. Joseph, did you want to say anything?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you, Tony. Very, very significant sentiments to impart everyone with. And I would like to please invite James to give us some closing remarks. James is a very good friend of the campaign. So please take it away, James.
Thanks, Joseph. And most of all, thank you, Tony. We know how busy you are, and not just with little kids, but with a few other things to do. And so your willingness to take time right now to talk to Americans outside the country is really a testament to your commitment to us as a group. Obviously, you mentioned that that's not a coincidence, that you were once yourself an American abroad, growing up in Paris in the 1970s, and I know how much that has impacted your identity. Unlike John Kerry, you don't have to pretend to not speak French. You actually speak perfect French, and that's admirable. And your own experience has really informed how you've approached us as Americans abroad. And you understand, as you said at the outset, that we're ambassadors for our country, for its values, that we're part of the country's soft power, and that we enrich America with our diversity. And as a result, we've experienced you as a champion for Americans abroad in this election, and we're very grateful for that. And what we hope is that you'll continue to be our champion when you take up, as we hope, a prominent role in the Biden administration. And why do I say that? I say that because it's important that even after the election, we not lose sight of the issues that are special to Americans abroad. And those are things that Democrats abroad are also very engaged with. And they range from FATCA to tax and citizenship and consular services and Social Security and healthcare. And that's why the letter from Vice President Biden was so important and so encouraging, because he acknowledged that Americans abroad have their own legitimate interests and that his administration does intend to consider these. No promises as to the results, but that we're on the radar screen, and that's really important. And we know, Tony, that wouldn't have happened without you. And of course, we're very grateful for Joseph's hard work and persistence in helping make that happen. So speaking of hard work, this is a point, as we come to the end of the road, it seems appropriate to thank folks abroad who have been tireless in their efforts during this election. Obviously, the first place to start is with Julia Bryan and the amazing team at Democrats Abroad, who've done such an incredible job organizing so many informative events and worked so hard on getting out the vote with the great results that she's already told us about. Ambassadors for Biden is another organization that's been hugely active and engaged, much appreciated. On the fundraising side, we are fortunate to have a fearless leader in Mary Tabai from the Biden campaign, who has worked closely with Americans abroad for many years, and she's a real asset to Democrats at all levels. I'd also like to take, and if you'll bear with me a moment, to just acknowledge some of the many individuals who've taken on the tireless but necessary task of fundraising for the campaign. They include Charles Adams, Daniel Crosby, Mark Bergman, Nick Kokrika, Susan Harrington, Julia Marchari-Torreza, Bill Bean, Tony Gardner, good friend of yours, Ida Levine, Maria and Peter Kellner, James Clark, Bill Benjamin, Henry Richotte, Ebbs Burno, Richard Weiner, and all the folks at Abroad 2020, an organization in London who've done so much. And it's really been great working together to get Vice President Biden elected. Should also mention that people have been active, not just in the presidential election, but the abroad community has hosted a lot of events for key Senate races. And we're really hoping that we'll also ditch Mitch next week. And at every level, it's really about making sure that our voices are heard from abroad. Our voices abroad are heard in Washington. With your help, Tony, and with the participation of the folks on this Zoom, we'll continue to build the abroad community as a politically active and engaged group that will advocate for its interests and support its candidates. Tony, I remember sitting with you in your mother's dining room in Paris in September 2019, when many people had written off the candidacy of Vice President Biden. And I'll say it was a fundraising dinner, and the turnout was disappointing. And so how incredible is it that we are all here today with hundreds of connections on this Zoom and so many Americans at home and abroad who are inspired by the very real prospect of electing Joe Biden and getting America back on track. So the only thing left for us to do now is for those who can still to vote, get their family to vote, their friends to vote, and that's what's left. So thanks, Tony. Thanks again. We look forward to good news next week, to a brighter future, and go Joe.
Thanks, my friend. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to all the attendees for joining. Thank you again, Tony. And Joseph, thank you so much for setting up this call. You and James, really appreciate it. And for everyone, if you guys want to see this video, it's on Facebook at facebook.com/DemsAbroad. You'll find it there. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks, Tony.